Former President Donald Trump is making predictions about the future of the Republican Party. During his speech at a retreat for top Republican donors over the weekend, Trump said that he's optimistic about the party's chances of taking back control of Congress in the 2022 midterm elections, as well as recapturing the White House in 2024. The event was closed to the press, but Trump's prepared remarks were obtained by CBS News. The former president did not say whether he would be on the 2024 presidential ticket, although he has alluded to a potential run in the past. So Adam Brewster is here to discuss what we know. So thanks for joining us. What do we make of Trump's claims that the GOP will retake Congress in the midterms?
No, first and foremost, I think when you have your party's top donors all gathered in one spot, it's a good optimistic message to present as they start to look at how they're going to spend their money and wield their influence over the next year and a half heading into the November 2022 midterm elections. But it's also a statement rooted in some history, right? The president's party typically struggles during the midterm elections. We saw that in 2018. Democrats recaptured the House, won a few dozen seats after the Republicans had a solid control of that chamber, and that led to Speaker Pelosi and all of those clashes during the Trump administration. President Obama's party lost seats during the 2010 midterm elections. Democrats in that election barely held on to the Senate. And what's also different and unique this time is just how tight both chambers are, right? Democrats have just a few seat majority in the House. There is little room for error for Democrats and plenty of opportunities for Republicans to go on offense and try and flip that chamber. They would only need to, go on offense and flip a few different elections. And in the Senate, it's a 50-50 tie. The only reason Democrats have control is because Vice President Harris is able to cast that tie-breaking vote. So it is a dead even split. Certainly, no room for error again for Democrats there. So it's a good message to present to your donors that you're feeling optimistic going forward into the 2022 elections. But it is often a difficult year for the president's party, that first midterm election cycle after a new president is elected.
Yeah. So during his speech, the former president also took aim at Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, painting the Republican Party as weak under his leadership. I believe he called him a stone-cold loser. He continues to take aim at other members of his own party. Usually they're sort of leading members of his own party. What do you make of this kind of mixed messaging? On the one hand, he's saying, the party is strong, we're going to retake Congress by the midterms. And then sort of on the other hand, he's saying, but the leadership is weak and the party is suffering because of it.
I think stone cold loser was the PG, one of the PG terms that the president used to describe Senator McConnell on Saturday night. And there's been no love lost between the former president and the Senate Minority Leader in recent months, right? Ever since Mitch McConnell went on the Senate floor after he voted to acquit President Trump in his second impeachment trial and, said that he was quote, practically and morally responsible for the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. The president has put out multiple statements attacking McConnell and, trying to say that he saved McConnell's election, something that's been disputed by the former head of the National Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee. And so there's been no love lost between them publicly. And so it's just something that, we've seen. Anytime that someone has attacked the president, he goes out and attacks them as well. It is something we saw frequently when he was a candidate before he was elected and then while he was in office. And this is certainly something that is continuing. He, in that speech, didn't think that, McConnell did enough to try to block certification of the 2020 election. That was one of the gripes that he had about them. But, this is something that we've seen publicly, not just something that the president has said behind closed doors. And there have been some reports that the attacks on McConnell were not necessarily something that was well received by the donors who were in the room listening to the president's speech.
That is fascinating because that brings me to my next question. He also complained about fraud during the 2020 election. And according to the Washington Post, he said that he was, according to the Washington Post, he was disappointed in former Vice President Mike Pence for confirming the results of the election. So I wondered if this sort of talk and this sort of language works for Republican supporters, Republican voters, and in this case, we're talking about Republican donors. Do they still want to hear about how the election was stolen from him?
I don't necessarily know that that's something that the donors want to hear, but we do know that polling after the election and polling as recently as early this month has shown there are Republicans who believe the 2020 election was rigged. Now, we know that that was not the case, right? Afterwards, there were more than 60 court cases that the former president and his allies lost. Former Attorney General Bill Barr, so there was no widespread fraud at a level that was going to change the results of the election. The Department of Homeland Security and federal, state, and local election officials said it was the most secure election ever. These are results that were checked and double-checked before they were signed and certified. Some of the complaints we've seen from the president, or the former president, has focused on some of the changes that were made outside of state legislatures. Those are things that could have been challenged before the election in courts. I think about that in Wisconsin, where there was a recount and a legal challenge after the election for rules that had been in place largely during the 2016 election and were only then challenged after it appeared that he had lost to President Biden. So it's something that we've seen him talk about a lot publicly. It is probably something he will continue to talk about. But it is also something that you've seen a few lawmakers bring up in this debate around the country as state legislatures reform their election laws. We saw, a state senator in Iowa say a majority of the members in the Republican caucus here believe that the election was stolen. Now, this is not a frequent talking point, and the people who are leading these bills don't often go so far as to say that, but they do point to that mistrust that voters have in elections. And, you see Republicans still believe some mistrust going back to the 2020 election from just a recent Reuters poll that showed a majority, 55%, believed the election was rigged.
Oh, that's interesting. So you brought up, what we have been seeing, which are these mostly sort of Republican-controlled state legislatures really pushing voting limitations, right? But I think this is kind of interesting. There's a new report from the Center for Election Innovation and Research examining voting access across the country and found that 70% of states offer no excuse or all-mail voting and some form of early in-person voting. So what does that data really tell us about voting access in this country? We definitely have been focused on the attempts to limit voting access, but what do you make of this report?
Well, this kind of lays a very basic baseline out there. Those are the words that David Becker used, who is the executive director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and he and I, spoke at length about this report that they put out, and he said, look, this just establishes a basic benchmark to say, are states offering these basic forms of access? And it turns out most states are, and those span the political spectrum. There are deep blue states, there are dark red states, there are battleground states, all on that list. And then there are other states who, require an excuse to vote by mail. Some of those states do allow anyone to vote early in person, without providing an excuse. Others do not provide that opportunity. Those are the most restrictive states. And, in Becker's words, those states that aren't offering both are not meeting the 21st century voters' needs. And he also points to the fact that this isn't just about access, but about security. If there is something that is going wrong with an election, be it fraud, which we know is exceedingly rare, be it foreign interference, be it a cyber attack, that is something that if you are having early voting, if you are doing mail voting, you are going to be more likely to catch early and be able to resolve the problem. He said if there's something that comes up at 11 a.m. on election day, that is going to be something that is very hard to fix. And so by having voting only during a 12-hour window for most of your residents, that is an insecure way to vote. So as we listen to this conversation in the states about reforming their systems and how this is all about security, that is something that is very important to keep in the backs of our mind. Now, among these states that do offer anyone mail voting and anyone early in-person voting, there are, of course, differences between how easy it is to access voting. There are differences in photo ID requirements. There are different ways that you are allowed to register to vote, online, in person, same day. There are different deadlines for how soon before an election you have to register to vote. So this is not, a definitive ranking. It's a basic measure. And Becker said even those states that do have that, all of them all 35 of them plus Washington, D.C. have things that they can do to improve their election systems, to make them more accessible and more secure.
All right, Adam, thank you very much.
Thank you.